Hello, I'm going to be showing you how to make a forest floor style base that will go great with some reasonable marines, especially if you are basing them for coherency. We start off with a cork slab, but I don't want this to end up looking like cork, so we break off small chunks and place them down. I know what I'm going for here. I want it to look like he's just finished walking over a muddy part of the forest floor and has been keeping to the rocks. We're using a very thin layer of super glue to speed up the drying process and test fitting the mini as we are going. Once we are happy with the mini's position, we need to make the cork not look like cork, but rather rocks. So I come in with the pliers and start to rip bits off. This way we ensure there is no flat cork on the top, except in the areas that I know the mini will be directly attached to. We start to fill in the gaps with these little bits of cork that have been ripped off, just to make it look like one big rock rather than multiple rocks. This will help with the painting later. We now clear down a bit and start to bring out the texture paints. I don't ever like to use just one paint. I feel like this doesn't give you enough different textures on the base. Just as a note here, the Martian ones are the same as the Agrellan ones, just tinted differently. Using a spreader or an old paintbrush, we start to position the paste. I'm not really looking for much here other than just trying to get differences in the base and variation. You want to be careful here to keep those rims crisp and clean, so wipe them off while the paint is still wet. On a note here, the texture spreader is just not worth it, just use an old brush. We now let the texture paint dry and then we come back with black primed bases. We now want to add some colour to the bases, starting by blocking in the areas. For this, the rocks are Mechanicus Std Grey. Don't worry too much about full coverage, as having parts that you can't reach black primed, or even the cork showing through the prime, isn't going to cause an issue. Because we're going over the textures, you don't need to be too tidy, so use an old or cheap brush is preferred here. We can be as messy as we want here, and we don't need to be afraid of those rims, as they can be tidied up later. We now move on to the main tones, Caliban Green and Rhinox Hide. I've covered half the base in the Caliban Green and the other half in the Rhinox Hide. Not worried too much about blending them together, as this should be covered later on. Again, no need to worry too much about the prime showing through here in these hard to reach areas. We now move on to the dry brushing. This is where we start to make the features pop. Starting with Adminstratum Grey, we cover the rocks, trying to pick out the details. I'm following the flavour of the month here and using makeup brushes as dry brushes. Honestly, they work quite well. No complaints here. We then move on to Mournfang Brown for the Rhinox Hide areas. I went a bit too hard here and lost some of the Rhinox Hide, but we can push the contrast back up later, so don't worry too much. The green is then dry brushed with Moot Green, going really light when dry brushing just to pick out some of the heavier details. At this point, I add in Screaming Skull, especially into the Mournfang Brown here, to pull the contrast back up. This section is entirely optional, as it will help later with the contrast after everything is washed down. Speaking of washes, it's now time to move on to the washes. We use Beltane Green to cover all the green, not worrying too much about any overspill, as it would just add more colours into the areas and help pull it together. I then do the same with the Agrax Earth Shade for the browns and the rocks. This helps the rocks pull in with the rest of the base as well. After this, we dry it quickly with a hairdryer and then tidy down. At this stage here, all of the colours are down, so now it's just time to add the foliage. I want to mount the Mini at this stage, so I can pull the foliage in around the Mini. I always pin through Cork just to give it more grip, pushing the Mini through to make a hole, then adding some super glue and pushing the Mini back through the hole. We can now move on to the foliage. I'm just using bits here I got from a Secret Santa and trying to hide the gaps around the feet to make it look like he's not just floating in the air, he's rather standing on top of rocks with grass underneath him. You'll see me at this stage here struggling with my fingers and a knife. Just use tweezers please, it makes everything so much easier. You don't get super glue on your hands and you don't get super glue on that nice crisp base ring. When adding the lichen, you don't really want to make it look like it's coming from nowhere, so I like to have it coming out of rocks or from a tuft, just trying to avoid having to blend it into the base with texture paint again. With the tufts and the lichen down, we can now move on to the grass. With the tufts and the lichen down, we can now move on to the grass. I'm using static grass here and battlefield grass by the Army Painter. You want to keep the latter here as far away from possible as superglue as possible, as this will discolour it to make it a horrible muddy brown. I like to focus everything towards the rocks and work out from there, just so everything feels like it has a place and nothing is coming from nowhere. You can very easily leave the Mini at this stage and be happy with it. I decided I wanted to try something new here and push myself a bit further from my comfort zone. Something I would highly recommend you try whenever you get an opportunity to. I continue to add more interesting foliage to see where it goes. I don't really know what I'm doing at this stage here, I'm just trying to add a bit more colour, so we're going to add some flowers. I also know I want to add a bit more height onto the base, so I'm using some long reed-like grass just to put a bit of elevation into the base to make it feel less flat. We now have the Mini based and finished. This was a bit of a scary experience to make a tutorial on this, however a great way to cement your knowledge in a process is to show people how you've done it. I feel like going back onto this creation again later, I will be able to push my skills to the next level. I look forward to seeing what you guys make with this tutorial.